Hello everyone, welcome back to my top 100 favorite video games of all time. Make sure you check out the previous videos as we now dig into the top 10, my current, as of the end of 2024, favorite games of all time. Starting off with number 10, Final Fantasy XII. This was something that was so radically different from traditional Final Fantasy that at first I actually did have a little bit of trouble getting into, because it felt so different. The combat felt almost MMO-like, and it just felt story structure-wise different. But then a little bit after it came out, I got back into it, and it immediately became one of my favorite games of all time. I think it is one of the strongest stories in Final Fantasy, and I think what throws a lot of people off is that it doesn't have quite as much of the clear-cut, cookie-cutter, this is the bad guy, these are the good guys, and the cast feels more ensemble, even though there is a main character, and I really think they should not have added that element. They should have stuck with the original structure of 12, but that's another story. But for what it is, I think it is one of the most well-crafted worlds in all of Final Fantasy. You know, anything with the Ivalice stuff is always fantastic and does a good job with that, but here, you know, the environments come together so seamlessly, and one thing that always stands out, which feels odd to say, but the architecture in all the different cities and dungeons, there's so much incredible detail, and it I think it's one of the most amazing art books in the entire franchise, because what they did from an area that's not always appreciated with how, again, stuff like the city is structured and how real everything feels, and everything felt like it has an ancient history to it. And I love the cast, which has all been, it's very ensemble and given very kind of equal weight to a lot of people, that I feel like it throws people off with not being as almost Power Ranger-y, like this is the main character, these are the good guys, this is the bad guy, the more political feeling story. There's a lot to it that I get why not everyone is as involved in the storytelling and the characters, but to me I think it's one of the best in the franchise, one of the most incredible worlds, and it just has the weight of history behind it, which is hard to get across. And I think it's an incredible achievement that I'm glad to see has gotten more recognition over time. And number 9, Final Fantasy VII Remake, in particular the Intergrade edition with all the extra, like, you know, Yuffie chapters and stuff on the PS5. I was completely blown away with how much I love Final Fantasy VII Remake, because I was one of those people that was very skeptical, especially being the going slightly different direction with some elements and expanding the story and wondering, is it going to be expanded as in add more actual depth to the storytelling and the characters and the worlds, or is it going to be just padding, or is it going to be nonsense? How's it going to turn out? I love Final Fantasy VII Remake. It is obviously one of my favorite games ever. I am shocked by how great that was, and it's one of those games that I will go back and replay a bunch of times because I had so much fun. It was an amazing experience, and was something that was a completely different experience from when I pictured a remake of Final Fantasy VII to be, and I was shocked that since it didn't match that vision, that I liked as much as I did. And my number 8 is the original Final Fantasy VII, the big iconic RPG that was, for a lot of people that I knew, it was their first RPG ever. I think for a lot of people had that in common. You know, I started with the original Final Fantasy on NES, but I really didn't know that many people that had played a whole lot of the Final Fantasies until 7 came out. And that was such a huge deal, and I remember just a couple of people had the strategy guide, and we passed that around and things, and it was fun to have a lot of people playing it around the same time, and being that age, and not wanting to ruin things. So in conversations, you kind of have to kind of suss out, like, you know, where are you in the story, and it's one of those games that became such an instant hit and has really become an absolute timeless classic. It's one of the great iconic games of the PS1 era, and has spawned a franchise within the franchise. You know, Final Fantasy VII at this point is really its own franchise, and it's just been one of the favorites for me forever. And then again, this year, you know, watching these videos and how high Infinite Wealth was, and then going from that, getting Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, my number 7. Yes, shockingly, I can't believe it myself, but I have to be true with, you know, my favorite games. This genuinely is my new second favorite Final Fantasy ever, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Yes, as someone who's been playing Final Fantasy since the original on NES, this is my new second favorite. I think it's that good. It took all the elements that were shocking in Remake with how well they turned out and how it really just added to the feeling of the world and the characters, and it did that to a scale, like doing that within Midgar is cool. Doing that on the scale of a continent is insane. I loved everything in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I really genuinely feel like it's one of the greatest games of the modern era. It's one of the best experiences I've ever had. I can't imagine what the third part is going to be like in this trilogy, because I think I really feel like they are making the greatest trilogy in video games. I will go out and say that. I am a super fan now of this remake trilogy. I just think it is so good. And again, I was skeptical when things were first coming out if I was going to like it at all, or if I was even going to be interested. And man, parts 1 and 2 are my top 10 games of all time. Rebirth is that good. Moving on to number 6, we have Xenosaga Episode 3. Episode 2 was on this list much lower though, because it did have a lot of weird choices and issues, as good as it was. 3 really took the best of 1, and then the things that actually did work in 2, and melded them together to be one of, if potentially the best sci-fi RPG ever made. It really is so good, and it's a brilliant conclusion to this segment of the story. It was supposed to go on, and constantly with all these Xeno-type games. There's supposed to be a huge series that never quite gets done, but this was a great conclusion to that Xion Cosmos part of the story, and again felt like a good conclusion to that, and was so incredibly well made, and it's just unbelievable these games are not as appreciated as they should be. And they really, I think if they ever, especially with the popularity of Xenoblade Chronicles, if we got a collection of these, like an HD collection of these on modern consoles, I think they would do incredible, and these games would finally get their due, because they're some of the best RPGs ever made. My number 6, Xenosaga Episode 3. My number 5, Xenosaga Episode 1 for the PlayStation 2. And really, what beats it out is that game truly was a shockingly amazing experience, where I was more of a big Final Fantasy fan, and then at the time of playing Xenosaga, my favorite game of all time was Xenogears, and it was sort of like an oddity where the one RPG that stood up above all these other games that I really loved and was more than any of these other strategy games. And I had just played Final Fantasy X, had just finished that before getting Xenosaga Episode 1, and I played Final Fantasy X, and I'm like, I can't imagine another game beating this just in general. Like, just coming fresh off Final Fantasy X, it was probably more like my third favorite Final Fantasy overall. 12 had not happened yet, and at the time I liked it more than 8. 8, it's a lot of nostalgic stuff that pushes it up higher, but it just felt like one of the most perfect video games ever made. And then Xenosaga Episode 1 came out, and I liked it infinitely more, and I was shocked, because, again, I'm more of a sci-fi guy, and Xenosaga is one of the greatest starts to a new franchise, really, re-envisioning of that Gears saga was never completed. And just out of the gate, it is the equal of the other greatest RPGs of its era. It is such an amazing experience, and I replay that one all the time. It's remarkable. Being that out is my favorite Final Fantasy of all time, and I can't imagine another Final Fantasy topping it, because nothing has ever quite come close. We have my fourth favorite game of all time, Final Fantasy IX for the PS1. This game is so special to me. And from a connection to the characters and the story and the emotional pull towards them and that element, it's actually more like my second favorite game ever. But there's some elements of a couple other games that kind of beat it out as favorites. But to me, this is just the perfected Final Fantasy. It is a return to a lot of the classic, very fantasy setting and focus, but then takes all the amazing things they're able to do with games like Final Fantasy VII and 8 and put them together and I still think it is the absolute perfect Final Fantasy and one of the greatest games ever made. My favorites are not necessarily always in some sort of order of what I think are like the best games ever, because that would be a very different list. But I really think Final Fantasy IX is, I'd say, top 5 RPGs ever made. It's really good. It is just a perfect game from start to finish. And beating that out is a game that's not quite perfect, but it is the most ambitious game ever made, I feel like, especially within this genre. Number 3, Xenogears for the PS1. A case of, obviously, some of the budget was cut later on, but in general it was a case of just biting off way more than you can chew. This game, it's astounding how expansive it is, and the fact that it was just supposed to be a chapter in a much larger saga, it's insane. The ambition is pretty astounding, and what they're able to accomplish with Xenogears is breathtaking. Like, it is one of the most intellectual stories in an RPG from that time period, without losing any of the factor of the fun element that there has to be as well. You can't just be a think piece. With being a video game, there has to be that interactive element, has to also be enjoyable and fun. And I think it captures that, and it's something that needs to be experienced. Not everyone is going to love it, but I think in playing it, you'll just be blown away by the ambition of it, and just the scope is remarkable. Then a game that admittedly does not quite match that scope and the quality of its storytelling, but there's other elements that are, in a way, my favorite game ever. My number 2 is Xenoblade Chronicles X for the Wii U, and please, please remaster this and bring it out for the Switch 2 or whatever, and let more people play this game, have it not stuck in the Wii U, because it is, I think, the greatest video game world ever put out. Again, Xenoblade Chronicles X has a few issues with, partially I think more in the telling of its story than the story. The story is good. I think it has a reputation of the story not being great because of the way you have to experience it. A lot of the story is focused more on the building of life on Mira, and I think an unfortunate percentage of the storytelling is only through side quests, most of them largely optional to a point, to where I feel like if you just mostly stick with the main narrative, it feels very lacking. And there are a few missteps as well. Tonally, there are some things that come across as too much leaning on the comedic in moments that don't feel appropriate. The idea of having the very Western style, like, make your own character, silent protagonist that doesn't really feels out of place, shouldn't be there. Should be like a fully fleshed out character, or just have Elma be the main character. There are those issues in that aspect of the game, but everything else is, the fact that this thing is on a Wii U at all is just crazy, with how amazing from even just a technology standpoint it looks and how well it runs. But Mira is my favorite video game world ever. I've never had a greater experience exploring environments, and the balance of re-exploring those environments, and when you have new ways of travel, from being on foot and being just overwhelmed with the vastness of everything, and just the structure of the world as well. The layering of it was never quite matched in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 3, even though those worlds were spectacular. There's something about the design element of Mira that far surpasses them. And then as you move then from on foot to having the Skells, you can access new areas in new ways, go back to places you've already been. Now there's a whole new level that you can access above it. And then when you finally are able to fly with the Skells, take your mech all around the world, flying, there's a whole new level of the world in the sky, and it's incredible how much it builds upon the experience as you gain new ways to re-explore seemingly familiar areas. You find that you're only familiar with a small portion, because the world is constantly evolving in the exploratory element as you gain new ways to experience and survive on this world. And there are just so many portions of X that are my favorite game of all time, that I feel like if the narrative structure was stronger, and it didn't end on a cliffhanger. We really need a sequel. But I feel like if those issues that it does have were addressed in a bit of a narrative reimagining, again, not much, but just kind of tweak it, fix things, bring the storytelling quality up to the level of the other games, it would be my favorite game of all time. Just that holds it back a little bit. But as far as exploring a world, that element of RPGs that I love, it's by far my favorite game ever made. I've never had a greater experience exploring a world. My favorite game of all time, though, is Xenoblade Chronicles. Definitive Edition is admittedly the overall better game, but if I had to pick something, I would say the Wii, just because of that first experience. It really is, you know, the greatest first impression I've ever had with a video game. There are lots of moments throughout my life playing certain video games that a lot of them that are still that make it onto this top 100 are based on that first experience, and where you were in your life when it happened, what age you were, what other things were going on, and that first impression. And that's what makes certain games, games like Eternal Ring, that I can imagine being on anyone's top 500, is in my top 100 because of when and how I experienced it. This has that to the greatest degree, as well as being, I genuinely feel like, one of the best games ever made. Really do. That it just, within the first 10 minutes, it was my new favorite video game ever. It really just immediately captured me faster than any game I've ever played, and took me through my favorite experience I've ever had with a video game. And it still is to this day. I keep waiting. Again, X was the closest that ever came. Just wish it was stronger with the storytelling element to something being like that experience that I had buying that game, putting it in the Wii. And at that point, it was not long after, I'd just been married, and my wife and I were in our new place, our first apartment together, and putting that thing in the Wii and just being blown away by that experience, and nothing has ever quite lived up to it for me. But hopefully something in the future will come close, because I yearn for that. I love when my favorite game of all time stays my favorite, but it's only changed a few times over the years. There were lots of games that stayed forever, and then Xenogears was my favorite until Xenoblade Chronicles. Of course, you're always kind of chasing that experience. You want to have that feeling again, and I long for the day when something does match or even surpasses Xenoblade Chronicles. But for me, that is my favorite game of all time, and I'd love to hear what some of your favorite games are. Thank you for joining me for this list. I hope you enjoyed the journey through all these different parts and getting up through my top 100, my favorite games of all time. And now, just as a little kind of bonus thing at the end, I wanted to highlight a couple of games that are either upcoming or I haven't had a chance to play, that what in the future do I think might stand a chance at making it onto this list? What could actually, crack in here in the future that's upcoming? Because there are a few things that are on the horizon that might actually make this list in the future, might change things up. One, of course, being the very recently announced Like a Dragon, Yakuza Pirates in Hawaii. I really love that series. Xeno, Final Fantasy, and Yakuza Like a Dragon are my three favorite franchises these days, and that looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. I really expect that one to make it on this top 100. I genuinely think it's going to be great. And then, obviously, with how much I enjoy Final Fantasy VII, the remake Project 1 and 2, unless they completely screw up somehow, there's no way 3 is not going to be on this list in the future, as well as anything from Monolith Soft, of course, stands a chance, as much as I really love their games. But again, thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear what some of your favorites are, and what games you are looking forward to in the future.